Good morning. I am Therese Druart from the Catholic University of America, staying with Richard Taylor near a lake. Is al-Ghazali really an Asharite theologian, or is he rather a masked Avicennean? This question recently has been much debated, but was already raised long ago by Ibn Tufayl in his preface to his philosophical novel Hay ibn Yaqzan. He tells us, as for the books of the master Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, what he says in them depends on his public. He says one thing in one place and a different thing in another. He charges others with unbelief because they hold certain doctrines, then turns about and accepts them as lawful. Ibn Tufayl specifically refers to al-Ghazali's views on the human soul and on rewards and punishment in the afterlife. In the Tahafut, the Incoherence of the Philosophers, in discussions 18 and 19, al-Ghazali condemns the philosophers for their denial of bodily resurrection and their affirmation that only souls receive rewards and punishments. Yet, in more esoteric text, which contains the science of the unveiling, he seems to endorse the opposite view. Richard Frank forcefully argued that al-Ghazali was more Avicennean than Asharite in his cosmology and understanding of causation, though Michael Marmora defended al-Ghazali's Asharism. More recently, Frank Griffin, in his 2009 very important book, Al-Ghazali's Philosophical Theology, maintains that al-Ghazali intended to create a new cosmology that moved away from concerns held earlier by both Muslim theologians and philosophers in Islamic lands. As for the question of the soul and the afterlife raised by Ibn Tufayl, Timothy Giannotti courageously faced it in his 2001 book, Al-Ghazali's Unspeakable Doctrine of the Soul. Giannotti deftly shows the tensions, even contradiction, of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali's views on the soul, according to the various genres of his works. In his philosophical works, and the Tahafut in particular, al-Ghazali criticized the philosophers for maintaining that they can prove that the human soul is a spiritual or immaterial substance that is self-subsistent and does not occupy space, and for denying the resurrection of the body. The Kalam text, in contrast, overtly endorsed the Asharite view that the human soul is an atom occupying space and therefore material that can be annihilated and subsequently recreated, but hint at other possibilities. As for the more esoteric text, such as the Ihya Ulum al-Din, the focus of Giannotti's work, they allude to the science of unveiling that yields the truth, but never become explicit about the true conception of the soul. They appear to endorse much of Ibn Sina's position, though not always his vocabulary. Yet all the texts of whatever genre affirm both spiritual and corporeal rewards and punishment in the afterlife. At the end of his examination of the Hikya on this issue, Jayanati concludes, while al-Ghazali does indeed seem to concord with Ibn Sina's doctrine of an immaterial soul, and even with his concept of an afterlife that affords no ontological status to the soul's corporeal associations and experience, we argue that al-Ghazali cannot be regarded as an Avicennian, even in his most intimate moments of disclosure. Why does Gianotti say that? He claims that al-Ghazali is not really interested in ontological speculation, which he considers irrelevant and distracting from his main purpose of preparing people for the afterlife, and therefore insisting on ethics and spiritual asceticism. So, according to him, al-Ghazali's unflinching insistence upon the belief in an afterlife that includes corporeal torments and pleasure is not really inconsistent with texts that strongly suggest that al-Ghazali does endorse an immaterial conception of the soul. Be reassured, I have no intention in this brief paper to deal with the complex issue of determining what al-Ghazali truly thinks about the ontological status of the human soul. This would be foolhardy. My very limited purpose is to examine once again criticism the Tahafut raises against the philosophers, and see whether, despite the tensions, there is some core common conception of the human soul. In doing so, I hope to show that discussions 18 and 19 express a consistent attempt to defend the necessity of an afterlife that includes corporeal pleasures and punishment, simply because for al-Ghazali, the intellect is not utterly distinct from sensation and imagination. Human beings are embodied beings, and, though the intellect is our greatness, we cannot conceive of a pure mind without any connection to the body, and so the intellection of material intelligibles involve a sensitive level of the soul. We reach God by means of our actions, including prayers and meditations, that somehow always involve sensation or at least imagination. What really troubles al-Ghazali is Ibn Sina's harsh dualism, even if he has great sympathy for other aspects of the Avicennean position on the soul. Ibn Sina himself, at times, could not be fully consistent with his own dualism. If we take al-Ghazali at his own words, we have to wonder why, despite his numerous and real inconsistencies, he still maintains one thing with great consistency, that is, that the afterlife includes both spiritual and corporeal rewards and punishments that necessarily imply bodily resurrection, even if spiritual rewards and punishments far outstrip anything corporeal. Are most of the criticism in the Tahafut in discussions 18 and 19 against dualism, and are they based on a fairly consistent view of the unity of human consciousness? I think so. Yet you may well raise two serious objections to my enterprise. First, in the Tahafut, al-Ghazali clearly warns us that his aim is simply to show that the philosopher's so-called demonstrative reasoning fails badly to be properly demonstrative. In order to do so, al-Ghazali indicates that he will use whatever arguments work to defeat the philosophers, and that the arguments he uses do not necessarily reflect his own views. Second, even inside the Tahafut itself, al-Ghazali is not consistent. His arguments in discussion 20 seem no longer to rest on an attack against dualism, but rather seem to endorse an Avicennean outlook. There, al-Ghazali concedes to the philosophers that he does not deny that after death, which is the separation of the soul from the body, the human soul subsists. He even calls the human soul a self-subsisting substance, Druart, even if he does not say that such substance does not occupy space. So I do not have the ambition of discovering al-Ghazali's true views on the human soul, but simply to point to what for him is a major philosophical difficulty. Giannotti maintains that al-Ghazali has little interest in determining the ontological status of the soul. This may well be true, but it is also possible that al-Ghazali simply found out that he was unable to resolve this problem, precisely because he wishes to uphold both the spiritual aspect of the human being, is highlighted in discussion 20, and the embodied one is presented in a fairly detailed manner in discussions 18 and 19. Therefore, leaving more or less aside the question of the ontological status of the soul, he focuses on its function. He may not be clear or simply uninterested in the ontological status of the human soul, but he is clear and interested in its function, which is to be the connecting link ensuring the unity of the activities of the human being. First, the function of the soul. The title of the Tahafut's 18th discussion addresses the philosopher's inability to prove that the human soul is self-subsistent substance that does not occupy space. What seems a redundant specification, i.e. that a spiritual substance does not occupy space, in fact clearly distinguishes the philosopher's view from that of the Asharite Kalam. Substance, Jawhar, for the Asharite, means an atom, which is defined as occupying space. For them, all beings except God are atoms or a collection of atoms, and so occupy space. So the qualification makes it clear that the philosophers intend to prove the immateriality of the soul. As such, for them a substance is a being that does not inhere in anything of for its subsistence, in contrast to accident, which must inhere in something else, i.e. a substance. Nothing for the philosopher implies that what does not inhere in something else must necessarily occupy space. So for the philosophers, there may be both material and immaterial substances. Al-Ghazali really insists still further on this immateriality the philosophers claim for the human soul by adding that it is neither a body nor imprinted in the body, a very Avicennean formulation. He then ends spelling out the philosopher's claim in specifying that the human soul is, I quote, neither connected with nor disconnected from the body. This last description of the human soul, according to the philosophers, may well point to al-Ghazali's discomfort with their position. How can the human soul both be not connected and not disconnected? How could there be a non-excluded middle? Besides, if the human soul is not connected to the body, why the resurrection of the body, which he staunchly affirms? This formulation may express al-Ghazali's bafflement. The philosophers at times cannot avoid assuming a connection between the human soul and the body, even if they wish to claim that at least after death there is no such connection. Thus such a connection or relation was a necessary condition for the coming to be of the soul. In the fourth proof of the 18th discussion, al-Ghazali tells us what is the function of a soul, any soul, i.e. to be one connecting link, rabita wahida, between the faculties that are numerous and distributed among many organs. In other words, the soul unifies the various activities of the living being. In the case of the human being, the soul allows each one of us to say, I have sight, I see, though we see through the eyes and not the feet. We attribute to the whole human being activities exercised by means of a specific bodily organ, as well as intellectual activities. The I takes responsibility, so to speak, for all the various activities, whatever organ or lack thereof they may require. Most of al-Ghazali's argument in the 18th discussion and the first of the two arguments in the 19th discussion focus on the unifying or connecting link that allows attributing various activities to one and the same human being and to make them his. In the 20th discussion about the resurrection of the body and bodily pleasure and pains in the afterlife, this notion of the soul as connecting link may explain that even if it is a self-subsistent entity, it may receive a new body and make it its own. Let us then look at each discussion and see whether we can get a better understanding of al-Ghazali's painful intellectual inability to combine a conception of the human being as embodied with a conception of the human being as a spiritual being. Second, the 18th discussion. The soul as connecting link is present in beasts as well as in humans, and so often in this discussion, al-Ghazali's strategy will be to show that the philosophers are really wrong to affirm some kind of unbridgeable gap between the sensitive and the intellective faculties. what are presented as characteristics of the intellect, and according to the philosopher, to be explained only by means of its immateriality, in fact, have a parallel in some sensory activity. This is the case for the first four proofs. Another strategy consists in acknowledging that there may be a difference between the intellect and the inner and outer senses, and therefore some characteristic of the intellect, but such difference from the sensory level as a whole is similar or parallel to the differences between various senses. Proofs 5 to 8 present that kind of arguments. Proof 9 tackles the problem of self-identity over time if it is grounded in the body. Proof 10 presents a very interesting approach of how to conceive of a universal if intelligibles of material realities, or at least some of them, retain some spatial aspect and therefore can be reduced to a special kind of image. Let us look at these different types of argument. A. Argument showing a parallelism between intellection and some form of sensation, and so denying the gap between them. Let us first return to the first proof that we began to examine earlier. The philosophers claim that if the soul were corporeal, and therefore imprinted in the body, say in the heart or the brain, then as these organs are divisible, one could at one and the same time both be knowing and ignorant of one and the same thing. This ignorance would have one location, say in the brain, and this knowledge another. Al-Ghazali shows that the impossibility of two simultaneous opposites of one and the same object of a faculty does not solely pertain to the case of the intellect. The same goes for the appetite present in both beasts and humans. Is it impossible to be repelled by what one desires? So this impossibility does not arise from a lack of bodily location, but rather because the faculties, although numerous and distributed among many organs, have a single link, namely soul. Al-Ghazali makes no ontological claim, but he simply shows that immateriality as such does not explain the impossibility to receive at one and the same time contraries in one and the same faculty. Is the same impossibility arise at the sensory level, which is necessarily connected with the body. The first proof refutes the philosopher's claim that the human soul must be immaterial. His intellectual cognition includes a grasp of indivisibles, and indivisibles cannot be received in matter because of its divisibility. Al-Ghazali, with some glee, points to the philosopher's self-contradiction, as they admit a grasp of indivisibles at the level of the estimation, and use Ibn Sina's own famous example of the sheep grasping the wolf's enmity, even if it has never observed a wolf before. Enmity is indivisible, since it is not necessarily in matter, even if it happens, in some case, to be grasped by means of something material, such as the wolf, color and shape. The second proof returns to the case of the shape and the wolf. The philosophers claim that any intellectual object of knowledge, abstracted from material things, if imprinted as an accident in a bodily substance, would lose its indivisibility. They are even ready, for the sake of argument, to substitute another formulation for being imprinted, such as being related, that would be more vague. Thirdly, al-Ghazali goes back once again to the wolf's enmity, which is indivisible. But afterwards he acknowledged that the philosopher could have claimed that the indivisibility of the wolf's enmity can be explained by the material receptacle being a single atom occupying space, but by definition indivisible, a Kalam position. Al-Ghazali dodges this issue, claiming first that refuting this claim would take too long, and then he affirms that making of the material receptacle a single indivisible atom would not solve the difficulty, as any human action requires power, will, and knowledge. And will and knowledge, being distinct from power, cannot have an indivisible atom as receptacle. One may know how to write, but not have the power to do so if one's hand has been cut off. We may will to write, but paralysis may deprive us from the power to do so. The third proof refutes the view that if knowledge were to be in a part of the body, then that part alone would be the knower. Such refutation is parallel to the point made in proof 4, and that we have already commented on. The human sees, even if it is only by means of the eyes. In other words, we claim that we see, and we do not say that our eyes see. The awareness of the object of sight is in the soul by means of the eyes, but is not in the eye. B. Let's move to arguments claiming that some difference between intellection and sensation is similar to the differences between different senses. The fifth argument tackles Aristotle's widely accepted famous claim that the intellect apprehends itself, whereas the senses do not sense themselves, and used to infer the materiality and self-subsistence of the soul. Al-Ghazali's first, not very convincing move consists in claiming that indeed the senses do not sense themselves, according to the usual course of nature, but that it could happen if the course of nature were disrupted, and of course for an arite, such a disruption is possible. His second argument, which he qualifies as stronger, brings another strategy. The senses do not show all the same characteristics. For instance, touch and taste produce their effect by immediate contact with the sensed object, whereas by contrast, sight requires a distance between the sense object and the eye. So why would not the intellect have characteristics that the other senses do not have, and so be able to apprehend itself, whereas the other sense cannot? Al-Ghazali language here tends to speak of intellect as a supplementary sense. The sixth proof deals with the contrast between the senses, which not only do not sense themselves, but also do not sense their organ, and intellect, which, were it to have an organ, would know about it. The ear does not hear itself, but the intellect, if located in the brain, for instance, knows about the brain. Al-Ghazali handles this argument of the philosophers in exactly the same way as the previous one. He concedes again that there is a difference between intellection and sensation, but only because of the usual course of nature that could be disrupted. He also claims that intellect is a supplementary sense, so to speak, may have characteristics other senses do not share. But Al-Farabi does not stop there, as he raises a deeper philosophical issue. The philosophers may claim that, if the human soul constitutes the heart or the brain, then the human would be constantly intellectually aware of it, or never be aware of it, since the human soul enjoys continuous self-awareness. Originally, the human does not know about the brain or the heart, but later comes to know about them only because he is told of their existence or through dissection of another human. The only relation the human soul can have to the body is an indwelling, and so if such indwelling were the case, since one always intellectually apprehends oneself, one should always apprehend this indwelling in the body, or not at all, if the relation is insufficient. Al-Ghazali's reply emphasized the embodied aspect of the human being, and maybe even parodies the language of the second presentation of the flying or floating man in the Schieffer's De Anima. I quote, "As long as man is aware of his self or soul, and is not inattentive to it, he is merely aware of his corpse and body. Yet the name, form, and shape of the heart are not specifically determined for him. Nonetheless, he affirms himself as a body, such that he affirms himself to be in his garments and in his house, whereas the soul, which the philosophers mention, has no relation to the garment or the soul or the house." Avicennean had compared the body to garments so that he could explain why it's not essential to our self-knowledge. Ghazali pursues the affirmation of the human being of the basis of body in self-awareness is constantly with him, while his unawareness of his heart shape and name is akin of his unawareness of the place of smell, i.e. the organ of smell, that it consists of two appendages at the front of the brain. Man is aware of himself and knows his aseity, reather, through which he subsists, is closer to his heart than to his foot. For he can suppose himself to continue to exist without a foot, but cannot suppose himself to survive with the non-existence of the heart. Thus, what the philosophers state regarding man's being at one time unaware of his body and at another time aware of it is not the case. Notice al-Ghazali's stark contrast to Avicenna's view in the flying man. For Avicenna, we can imagine ourselves without a body, though curiously, according to him, imagination is a faculty using an organ, whereas al-Ghazali here insists that self-awareness is awareness of the body, while not necessarily linked to a specific organ or part of this body. Proof 7 refers to Aristotle's point that apprehension through bodily organs causes fatigue, and that strong or even violent sensations weaken the sense organs, whereas such is not the case with the intellect, which grows stronger with exercise. Al-Ghazali concedes this, but objects to Ibn Sina's use of it to argue that the human soul, therefore, must be a purely material entity. Al-Ghazali's rejoinder maintains that it is not improbable that intellect in this matter would differ from the other senses, just as it is not improbable that some kind of motion weakens some bodies but strengthens others. The eighth proof rejects the view that in old age the diminishing capacities of the senses, in contrast to the increase in acuity of the intellect, establishes that the intellect has an act all by itself, and so is independent from the body and a self-subsisting immaterial entity. The same goes for the philosopher's argument that a grave illness may deprive someone of full access to intellectual abilities, but this is only a temporary situation, since when the human has recovered, he regains full access to what he knows, indicating that the material receptacle of cognition had not been affected. Intellect as a supplementary sense may differ from the other sense, and so not weaken with age. See the issue of self-identity over time. Ibn Sina had claimed that the human soul is individuated by the body, and had much trouble explaining the continuing individuation of this soul after the body's death. Curiously, al-Ghazali does not attend to this difficulty, but deals with the claim of some philosopher who takes the curious position that if the human being is nothing but the body with its accidents, and therefore does not have an immaterial soul, then one cannot explain continuous self-identity. Why? Because the body changes in size over time, each of its parts has been renewed, and nothing remains of the sperm. So there is no continuous identity, which according to him is solely grounded in the material human soul. For this philosopher, the material soul is individualized in itself. This is a curious argument, and al-Ghazali answers it in kind. He maintains that though the parts of the body are continually renewed, there still remains something of the soul that ensures continuous self-identity over time. He explained these by analogy. If there is a pint of water, and more water is added and mixed with it, and then some of the water is taken away, and more added, and is up to 1,000 times, there will still remain some of the original water, according to him. So the renewal of the parts of the body does not completely remove some of the original sperm, contrary to what this philosopher claimed. And so continuity in identity is ensured. Here again, al-Ghazali argues that the human is necessarily embodied. Though I have some doubt, he thinks this philosopher said anything that deserves a serious philosophical rebuttal. D. What is a universal? Of course, the key for the Aristotelian claim that the intellect has an act of its own that does not require bodily organ is the apprehension of universals, in contrast to that of particulars. Universals are intelligibles abstracted from any connection to matter, space, place, time, and position, etc. If al-Ghazali wishes to uphold the view that the human is necessarily an embodied being, he must offer a conception of the universals quite different from that of the Aristotelian tradition. The passage is tantalizing, but does not go into detail. It attacks the following philosophical position. I quote, "This proves that the universal, abstracted from sensible concomitant, is intellectually apprehended by man, and establishes in his intellect this universal, which is intellectually apprehended, is not something to which one points, and is neither position nor measure." Hence, it is either the case that its abstraction from position and matter is something in relation to that from which the universal is grasped, which is impossible, because that from which it is grasped has position, place, and measure, or in relation to that which grasps, namely the rational soul. It must then be the case that the soul has no position, nothing to which one points, and no measures. Otherwise, should this be affirmed of the soul, then it would have to be affirmed of the universal which indwells in it. Al-Ghazali does not concede such universal. For him, only what inheres in the senses inheres in the mind, except that it inheres in the senses is an aggregate, which the sense is unable to separate, whereas the intellect is able to separate it. The thing in the mind, separated from its associates, remains in its being particular, similar to the thing conjoined with associates. It is called universal in an unusual sense, in the sense that there is in the mind the image or form of the singled out intelligible first apprehended by the senses, a relation of that image to the individual instances of that genius being one and the same. Al-Ghazali's alternative to the universal of the philosophers simply is an image or form, and therefore, as he says, a particular material form. But what kind of image is it? His reflection on the hand explained the difference between the image in the imagination and that in the mind. The image of the hand in the imagination is a certain color and size. Such is not the case with the image in the mind, that there is no particular color or size, but still keeps the relative positions of the various parts of the hand, such as the palm, the fingers, and the nails. If one has seen one hand and grasped the spatial relations between its parts, seeing another hand will not change the intelligible image, but the hand cannot be understood without taking into account the spatial relations between its parts. Once again, al-Ghazali makes a parallel with sensation in suggesting that something similar happens in our sensory perception of water that leads to a single imaginative image for each experience of water. Ibn Bajjat, too, had alluded to this problem as he claimed that some philosophers assume animals grasp the universal because when they go to find water, they are looking for water in general and not a specific bit of water. 3. The 19th discussion. This discussion attacks the philosopher's view that it is impossible for the human soul, once it exists, to suffer non-existence, and so claims that it is everlasting. In the first argument, the philosophers maintain that, since the human soul is not imprinted in the body's death will not lead to its non-existence. Al-Ghazali reminds them that even if they would speak simply of a connection to the body rather than an imprint in the body, they would still need to explain why the body is necessary for the soul's coming to be, but is no longer necessary for its survival after death. That is, some philosophers say, the reason for the original relation of affinity or adaptability of the soul to the body, necessary for its coming to be, remains unknown to us, does not solve the problem. It still makes it improbable that such relation not be necessary also for the soul's survival. We will not spend time on the second argument, presented by a very confused follower of Ibn Sina, as it does not deal with the relation between body and soul, but rather rests on a confusion between possibility and potentiality, and a reification of non-existence, as it claims that non-existence of the human soul after death would require a potentiality for its non-existence that can only inhere in a body. In discussions 18 and 19, most of al-Ghazali's arguments centered on the relation between soul and body, and rest on a necessary connection between body and soul. They highlighted the similarity between the sensitive and intellective faculties of one and the same human soul. They culminated in the 10th and last proof of the 18th discussion, where al-Ghazali offers an alternative to the philosopher's conception of the universal, is separated from any kind of material features. To the universal of the philosophers, he substitutes a particular image, separated of most material accidents, such as color, size, and measure, but respecting the spatial relations between the parts of the material sensible. This kind of general image may be called universal, as it has only one and the same relations to all similar sensibles. He spells out the meaning of the universal in the following manner, which is striking, as he claims that we can get some general and position requiring image of a genus as abstract as body. This then is the meaning of the universal, with respect to both the intellect and the senses. For when the mind apprehends from the image or form of the body, it does not acquire from trees a new image or form of corporeality, just as it does not do this in the imagination, by apprehending the form of two instances of water at two different times, the same being the case with any two similar things. This does not allow for the affirmation of universal that has no position at all. Yet, in the following discussion, he defends a very different view and seems to endorse the philosophical position that the soul is a self-subsistent substance that does survive the death of the body. 4. The 20th discussion, or the giant fly in the ointment. After explaining why the philosophers claim that a human soul subsists after the separation from the body, but deny the resurrection of the bodies and their reunification with the human souls, and so deny corporeal rewards and punishment in the afterlife, al-Ghazali does not attack this view in defending a kalam outlook that emphasize the connections between soul and body. That is to say that at death, both soul and body perish, but both later on are resurrected, i.e. recreated. He indicates that he does not deny, 1, that there are in the hereafter kinds of pleasures superior to the sensory. Notice that this does not exclude corporeal pleasure. And 2, he does not deny that the soul survives after the separation from the body, but he denies that this can be known by intellect alone. Such knowledge comes through religious law. For him, what is contrary to the religious law is the denial of the resurrection of the body, as well as the denial of bodily rewards and punishment. That refusal of bodily resurrection implies. In order to uphold the resurrection of bodies and the corporeal rewards and punishments, he claims that, I quote, the existence of noble things does not indicate the negation of others. Rather, combining the two represents what is more perfect, rendering the thing promised the most perfect of things. Moreover, this is possible, hence, belief in it is obligatory. He then forcefully maintains that the Quranic descriptions of the afterlife cannot be understood metaphorically, and begins a refutation of the philosopher's argument for the impossibility of the bodily resurrection. In his reply to a first series of arguments, al-Ghazali indicates that the survival of the soul after death is not contrary to the religious law, but even indicated by it. The resurrection of the body is then possible by returning the soul to her human body. For an individual is what he is by virtue of his soul, not his body, since the parts of the body change over for him from childhood to old age, and undergoing change and nourishment. His humors change with old age, while yet remaining the very same human. Therefore, it is possible for God to return to this soul a body similar to the first one, not the original body. He indicates that this understanding of resurrection could be considered by some as a form of transmigration, but he has no problem with this. Though he denies transmigration in this life, he does not deny it in the afterlife. To the objection that in this life a fairly lengthy and complex process is necessary to prepare a body to receive a soul, al-Ghazali simply replies that the preparation required for the body to receive the soul in this life may not be similar to the preparation required for this reception in the afterlife. This understanding of a survival of a self-subsisting soul that subsequently receive a body similar but not identical to the original one seems not at all in harmony with the views presented in the two previous discussions. For instance, in discussion 18, proof 9, al-Ghazali had argued for continuity of individuation by means of some parts of the sperm remaining through all the bodily changes, which he does not endorse in discussion 20. Here he seems to endorse the view that in fact nothing in the body remains the same throughout our life on earth, and that individuation comes from the soul. This surely highlights that al-Ghazali does not present a consistent view of the ontological status of the soul. but does not go counter his description of the soul, at least the description, the indication of his function, is a connecting link or unifying principle. Its function remains the same. He also, even in the 20th discussion, seems to consider embodiment as important for the human being, as he argues that we must believe in the resurrection of the body, as this resurrection of the body, in addition, so to speak, to survival of the human soul after separation from the body, renders the afterlife more perfect for the human being. Al-Ghazali may well have wanted both to affirm the spirituality of the human being and to take into account our experience of being embodied beings who cannot think without an image and whose self-awareness always involves some, even if vague, awareness of embodiment.